So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this presentation on neurodiversity and behavior. This is a part 2 of a presentation that the Center of Excellence for Autism and my Center of Excellence collaborated on last year. And there was a request to be able to take it to the next step. Unfortunately, it wasn't possible for me to collaborate yet again with the Center of Excellence for Autism. And so given that it is their expertise, I'm careful about the language that I'm using. And so hence the language of neurodiversity. I also thought that it would be a good idea to move beyond autism and really look at, in general, there's so many students that are under the umbrella of neurodiversity who have differences and challenges and so forth. And so to be able to walk it through from a wider lens, I think is a good exercise for us to do. So the presentation will be divided in the following sections. We're going to look at more specifically what does neurodiversity mean and what fits underneath the umbrella of neurodiversity. Then we're going to look at neurodiversity and anxiety, because oftentimes our students who are neurodiverse tend to be statistically more alarmed and anxious. And so we're going to look at that a bit more closely. Then we're going to walk through what are neurodiversity affirming practices. I found a document online from Megan Mott on neurodiverse affirming practices. A lot of the material I'll be presenting to you today is from her document. And you'll notice in the two handouts that you have in the chat, one of them is the slides of the presentation, but the other one is a kind of like a recueilli of different accommodations. And so that comes from her document from Megan Mott. Then we're going to look at what are some examples of neurodivergent differences. We're going to look at what doesn't work and why, and then we're going to finish off with the pyramid of intervention. CBM for years now has been promoting the pyramid of intervention and the Nurturing Support Center as a hub and a structure in order to support our students, from universal best practices to targeted practices for some to individualized practices for few. And so I thought, given the presentation, that it would make sense for me to tie it into the pyramid of intervention. So let's begin our journey. And so the first piece is I will be reading to you the definition from the dictionary on what is neurodiversity, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So neurodiversity is actually a term that was coined by Judy Singer back in the 1990s. And the neurodiversity is actually a short for neurological diversity. And so the two terms put together gives the word neurodiversity. It simply means that there is a range or a diversity of ways in which the human brain functions, a range of ways in which we think, we learn, and we relate to others. The dictionary defines neurodiversity as individual differences in brain functioning regarded as normal variation within the human population. And so we're not calling it a dysfunction. We are not calling this a disorder. We are just saying that it is part of the continuum of brain functioning. And yes, there are differences, but it is not considered problematic in itself. The concept that differences in brain functioning within the human population are normal, and that brain functioning that is not neurotypical should not be stigmatized. And the other way of defining neurodiversity is to be able to define the word inclusion in a group, in an organization, and et cetera, where people with different types of brain functioning come together. And so when we're talking about an inclusive classroom, what we mean by that is that we have a range from neurotypical to neurodiverse individuals in that space, and that we cater to their different needs. Now, Emmanuel kind of introduced briefly some of the bits and pieces that fall underneath the umbrella of the continuum of neurodivergence and sensitivity. And so here's the list, and I might have forgotten some. And so by all means, it's not an end-all be-all list. But Autism Spectrum Disorder definitely fits into this category. Looking at giftedness, looking at ADHD falls under that. Tourette Syndrome falls under that. Fatal alcohol spectrum, or issues in terms of a traumatic accident and brought an injury to the brain. Other pieces that are at play or, for example, sensory processing issues, emotional dysregulation issues, overstimulation, hypersensitivity, difficulty with executive functioning, sensory meltdowns. So all of that fits underneath this umbrella. The other piece, which I didn't know until I saw this document, is that things like dyslexia, dysgraphia, or dyspraxia actually fit underneath the umbrella of neurodivergence. Now, some of the key authors, and again, it's not an end-all be-all list. These are just some key authors that are sourced in terms of neurodiversity. So Megan Mott for neuro affirming practices is one of them. Judy Singer, she's the one who coined the term neurodiversity, and then a bunch of other authors. You may know some of the names, and some of them you may not know. There's no expectation that you go and read all of the material from these different authors, but if you are curious to read a little further, so here are examples from where you can pick and choose. There is some research, there is some research that has been done, that stretches back 100 years and more in terms of, they used to call it sensitivity or hypersensitivity. And so research has led to discover that sensitivity should be considered as along a continuum, and that everybody can be sensitive to some extent, but that some tend to be more hypersensitive or hyposensitive. We're going to look at that in a minute. And so our hypersensitive individuals statistically equivalent about 15 to 20% of our population. And so Carl Jung is one of the initial theorists that argued that some people are born being more sensitive than others, and that it is innate. So it's not something that is taught, it is something that we're born with. And those traits shape and interact with the experience and help the perception of that person within their world. And so he observed that when sensitive individuals are given the same degree of stress, especially in childhood, as comparison to a non-sensitive individual, that they are more likely to develop depression, anxiety, or anxiety later in their life. And so oftentimes these individuals, if we don't have the right accommodations that are put in place, and that they are trying to the best of their capacity to fit in similarly to a neurotypical individual, that this can lead to burnout and anxiety and depression. If sensitive individuals experience lower levels of stress or experience a nurturing upbringing that provides a good match for their inner traits, then they show no more of these difficulties than the non-sensitive individuals. So basically what we're saying here is that as long as the accommodations are put in place to allow for them to be more successful, then there isn't more depression in that clientele as long as those structures are in place. Other examples of research in this domain is Thomas Boyce, who is a doctor, and he, over the years, has generated over 200 different scientific publications on sensitivity. He has coined the term orchid child, and so kind of moving away from the term hypersensitivity and just using a different term, but we're talking about the exact same thing when we're using the word orchid. For those who are familiar with plants, the flower, the orchid, is actually a very sensitive plant and requires the perfect right conditions in order for it to bloom the first time and to bloom again and again. And so that's why he used the analogy of the orchid. So he was able to demonstrate that there are indeed exceptional biological sensitivities to certain individuals, and that they show actually higher cortisol levels in their bodies compared to a neurotypical person. And so they have a harder time managing stress if the right conditions are not put in place. And this can lead to higher risks of illness. We're more or less we're saying the same thing from the previous author to this one. But at the same time, even though they are orchid, being able to look at the positive side of hypersensitivity and recognizing the beauty in that, and that there is so many beautiful traits behind an individual who is sensitive. And there are so many articles out there that talk about this. Another known author is Elaine Aron. I can't recall the title of her book, but it was something around the sensitive child, and she talks about parenting and so forth. And so she talks about the fact that these children are easily startled, sensitive to pain, sensitive to bright lights, to strong smells, to coarse fabrics. And they are tending to notice more about the people around them and the physical environment. They're very self-aware and very attuned to their environment. And so these are kids that if you approach them too quickly or that you make a loud noise in their face, they easily get irritated and affected by that. Now, in terms of explanation from the neuroscience, trying to understand what are truly the differences on a physiological level between a neurodivergent individual and a neurotypical individual. And so one of the differences between the two is what we call the sensory gating system. And so for a neurotypical individual, the sensory gating system is a filter that helps us kind of minimize the sensory input. So I'll give you an example just to make it concrete. If you have a child who's going to play at the park and that they're trying to focus on a conversation, and at the same time, there's other kids there that are giggling and making noise, and you've got, let's say, some other kids playing ball, and you know, the ball is bouncing off the ground, and you've got all sorts of different stimuli that are happening from the environment. A neurotypical person will be able to cut out the noise and really just focus on the one thing that they're trying to pay attention to. In comparison to a neurodivergent individual, their sensory gating system doesn't function in the same way. It is somewhat perforated, and where stimuli can get through in a way that is out of control, out of the control of the neurodivergent person. And so think about the autistic child or even the ADHD child who is trying to focus on something, and that, you know, the student next to them is tapping their pencil and that's disturbing, or the lights on the ceiling are too bright and that is bothersome, and so forth. And so the sensory input then is unfiltered and almost like a tsunami kind of comes and overloads the brain. And so if we move it to this next slide, you've got the sensory gating system that is at the base there. But once the input comes in through that filter, then it moves up from the more primitive part of the brain and is slowly but surely digested from the more primitive to the more sophisticated part of the brain, which is the cortex and the prefrontal cortex. And so it explains that for a neurotypical individual, they have a less challenge of being able to regulate themselves and to be able to focus on reasoning than a neurodiverse person, because their filter is working well. And so for a child who's not just intense in their sensory world, but their emotions also are very intense. I'm thinking about gifted kids right now that, yes, are very bright, but they also have all of the experience that is intense, from the intellect to the emotion to the sensory experience. And so it becomes very overwhelming in the system to the point where it's hard to cut out the noise. And so it's more difficult for them to be able to regulate those emotions and to be able to focus on the reasoning part because of the overwhelm in this system. And so the consequence of that, the repercussions of that, is that emotional sensitive children have a harder time to regulate. And so they're more easily affected by their emotions, more easily pushed, also moved by those emotions. They are more easily overwhelmed by the emotional experience. And the danger there is that if they are overwhelmed time and time again on a daily chronic basis, the brain can only take so much for so long. And so what will happen is that the brain will put up defenses in order to be able to manage and to tolerate. And so the types of defenses that can come up is to numb out, work at numbing out the emotions, and finding ways to avoid such situations and kind of just putting up that armor. We notice sometimes, especially with our bright, whether Asperger's or gifted kids, that they tend to escape their emotional experience and they tend to intellectualize that experience in order to avoid the overwhelm and vulnerability of that emotional experience. These are also often children and adolescents that have a hard time to find their tears, because the tears tend to be quite vulnerable and overwhelming, and it's not an experience that is comfortable for a child who experiences things intensely. And so when you lose those tears and that you're stuck emotionally, the thing is that it is difficult to manage an emotion that you are not feeling and that you are stuck in. And so that's when behavior comes out left, right, and center. The other thing that is a challenge in terms of sensitive children is that adults sometimes have the reflex to want to preventatively or preemptively calm the child as fast as possible at all costs. And when we try to avoid the emotional eruption because it is too intense to manage and to handle, then it may give the message to the child that that's not acceptable, that it's not okay, that there's no room for them to be able to express themselves. They may feel embarrassed about that experience, feel shameful, that they shouldn't be feeling the way that they do, and so forth. A lot of our neurodiverse individuals, and I'm thinking especially of the autistic kids that tend to do stimming. And so stimming is the body's response in order to manage stress. And so some kids will twirl or they'll flap, or there's many different things that the body can do in order to manage stress. And so if they try to mask that because they think that it's not acceptable, then the masking on the chronic long term can lead to mental health problems and depression and burnout and so forth. And so all this to say is that, can we find pockets of time and space for those students to be able to let out the over-the-top emotion that they're experiencing? I'm not saying that we should be doing this in the middle of the class during a lesson, but can we schedule for those students pockets of time and space? You know, a lot of your schools at ETSB have engine rooms. And so those engine rooms are there exactly for this purpose, to allow for some of this movement to take place, for the sensory to be fulfilled, and for that to help channel some of that pent up energy, and so forth. Now, sensitivity, if we look at behavior at the tip of the iceberg, sensitivity can be one explanation behind the behavior that the student has. But please keep in mind that sensitivity is only one example. You know, I spoke this morning about trauma. Trauma can be another example. And you know, please know that for our neurodiverse population, who are more at risk for being under stress, are also more at risk for micro traumas. And as that is happening in their system, eventually can cause distress similarly to somebody who's gone through, whether it's physical neglect or physical abuse or things like that, because of the chronic kind of way that the micro traumas are happening. And so there's so many different pieces of the puzzle that are at play to be able to explain the behavior at the top. Now, I wanted to use this image to help make the distinction in the way that the individual manages stress from a neurotypical person to a neurodiverse person. So on this chart, on the left to right axis, we are looking at the degree of challenge that the child is being confronted with on a daily basis. So we're going from a daily challenge to a moderate level of challenge and stress, to then a situation that is completely distressful and threatening. And by the way, I'm using a lot the word child, but please understand that this is applicable to all ages. And so our children, our adolescents, our young adults. And so if you're here listening to the presentation and you work in adult ed, or that you work in high school, this material is applicable to all ages. So the axis from the bottom to the top, we're looking at the state of mind of the person, the level of emotion. And so we're going from a state of calmness to being alert, to being alarmed, to being afraid, fearful, to being in a state of terror. And so for the neurotypical person, we're looking at here, the line in the middle, we can see that their emotional state is proportionate to the situation at hand. And so when they're just faced with a daily challenge, they are in the space of being calm and alert, but they're not quite alarmed until they are faced with moderate stress. And if you continue on, then when there's a distressful situation, of course, they're in a place of fear or terror, but this is understandable given the circumstances. And so we can see that the neurotypical individual, the reaction to the circumstances are really quite proportionate. Now we're going to look at the curve here on the left. And so the sensitized person is that neurodiverse individual. It could be, and also trauma plays into that. So we can see that even under daily challenges, we're not even yet in moderate stress, how quickly the state of calmness moves from calmness to alertness to alarm, to a state of alarm, and even to a state of fear. If we look at the white column, we're almost at the place, and it depends on the child, at the place of terror, even within the category of daily challenge. And so we can see the difference between the neurotypical and the neurodiverse, how the limbic system, the emotional section of the brain, how it's the amygdala that is responsible for this, and the amygdala will react, and the person will become dysregulated much more easily given the differences in their bodies and their brain. And so the other curve here at the bottom, which is the person who is resilient, and we're not differentiating here between the neurotypical versus the sensitized. And so in both categories, if we are able to build more resilience in the child or in the person, that they will have a better capacity in managing in daily stress, in daily challenges. And so we will look at further in this presentation what is needed in terms of building resiliency, but the resiliency is the key in order to help accompany our neurodiverse individuals. Now, another concept that is important for me to bring up here is the term of neuroception. This was a term that was coined by Stephen Porges, a neuroscientist from the US, and he's the one who has come up with the polyvagal theory, for those who are aware of this author. And so the term neuroception is describing the neurobiological mechanisms that are involved in the perception of safety or danger or life-threatening situations in the experience, in the environment. And so we know now that our sensitized population will have a different type of neuroception compared to our neurotypical children. And again, it depends if there's a history of trauma or not. That has a huge impact. But the way that the neural circuitry works and the way that the body will, and by the way, this is not something that is conscious. This is something that is happening in a very subconscious way for survival purposes, that the brain will try to surveil the environment to see if they are safe or in danger. So when we have a very sensitive individual or an individual who's gone through trauma, the way that they will detect threat in the environment is much more sensitized. They will react more often and more intensely to a potential perception of threat, even though there isn't a real threat in the real world. But that's what the brain interpreted. And so a child with a vulnerable nervous system or a history of trauma can mistakenly detect a threat in the environment, even when they are safe, triggering defense's reaction, and hence what he calls the faulty neuroception. And so to go back to this imagery about the amygdala that gets kicked off so intensely, it is the neuroception that has kicked off the amygdala in that way, even though there wasn't a true threat or distress. We were really just at a daily challenge, but because of the neuroception, that was thrown over the top. We know statistically that our autistic individuals, and I would widen that to our neurodiverse population, that there is a big discrepancy statistically in terms of neurotypical and neurodiverse and their impairing experience of anxiety. And we know that this population are much more at risk for mental health and for anxiety experiences, partly because of the way that their brain kind of takes in the world, but also because of the way that if the adults don't fully understand the neurodiversity and that don't put in place the correct supports for them to be successful, then this adds on a whole other layer to the stress in the body. And so here are just some examples of where, there's a connection between neurodiversity and anxiety. And so some of them will come from the environment where there are the way that we communicate might be neurotypical and we're not honoring the differences in communication in our neurodiverse population. It could be that the person is trying to camouflage their differences, like not doing the stimming, for example, because they don't want to stand out, they want to fit in. And so that can create a stress on the system. The fact that things are not predictable for them and that there's an intolerance to uncertainty, them having negative experiences, when there is a lack of understanding of inclusion, this can bring on a whole kind of slew of consequences in terms of their daily experience. So that's on the one hand, the environment. And then on the other hand, looking at more from the neurobiological differences. And so I already mentioned about the amygdala. And so the amygdala not only gets kicked off more often, but more intensely, and their sensory can be hyperreactive as well. And so all of that plays into it. And so just to continue on the same conversation, all of the different triggers that the child can experience in their daily lives at school. And so whether it is the sensory that is being really loud or really overwhelming, whether it is the routine that is not adapted to their differences and that feels disruptive to them, or the expectations that are not well adapted to their differences, how maybe sometimes certain rules or regulations are not honoring inclusion and neurodiversity, that we're imposing a change on the child where they're not ready to be able to affect that change, being hurried, seeing injustices because they don't fully understand what is happening and so forth, and the fear of making a mistake, alongside with peer criticism. And these are just some examples. I have yet again other examples here. I'm going to let you take the time to read them in the PowerPoint, but these are just some examples of how our neurotypical population, the day-to-day adversity that they are faced with given their differences. Now, when we're trying to look at the neurodiversity affirming language and practice, we're trying to move away from defining the child's functionality in terms of high functioning or low functioning. And so instead, we are trying to describe the student in their level of need and challenge. And so functionality is labeling, it limits the perception of the capacity of the student, and we're distorting the reality that the child is actually, or the student, the teen is able to do certain things, but with the right conditions in place. It's much more accurate, ethical, and useful to describe the strengths and challenges as well as a level of support. And so, for example, looking at it from this angle, where we're looking at level 1, where the student may require some support, to level 2, where we're looking at some students that may require further support, and level 3, where students may require intensified support. And so looking at the student and what they need in terms of level of support rather than their level of functioning. And so this is just an example of neurodiverse affirming language where we're honoring the differences. And so the language and practices we choose have an impact on how people view and treat neurological differences. Instead of red flags or deficits as a term to define, perhaps we may want to use a word like trait or individual differences. Neurodivergence is not a problem to be solved, but a different way of being, which needs to be honored. Language matters. Using the terms red flag and deficits invoke fear, negativity, unacceptance, whereas traits and individual differences tend to neutrally describe the student. And so rather than saying Sarah is non-speaking, so saying things like Sarah is non-speaking and she uses a device to communicate. And so we're just stating as a matter of fact. Or an example would be Johnny expresses joy by hand flapping. And so we know us who are neurotypical, when we're excited about something, really excited about something, we do have physiological reactions to that excitement. And so Johnny, who is autistic, may be using hand flapping more often, but it doesn't mean that it is not, that there isn't a purpose behind the hand flapping. And so again, trying to shift the language, instead of using the word obsession, trying to use the term special interest or deep interest. And so the term obsession carries a negative connotation and insinuates that the interest of that particular individual is problematic. In reality, deep interest can be a beautiful strength, as well as an extremely meaningful and rewarding experience for the student. And so saying, for example, Jordan has strong visual spatial skills, or Katie can tell great stories about her favorite character. And so, just being mindful of that language. Again, instead of using the word impulsive, maybe using the word spontaneous. Instead of looking at the word attention seeking, looking at seeks for social connection. And this is true for neurotypical as well, not just for neurodiverse. Instead of talking about rigidity, maybe talking about benefits from predictability and routine and so forth. And so again, I will invite you to go and read more closely the slide, and this will give you just a shift in language. I mentioned before that there's a lot of beauty in terms of sensitivity. And so some of it, is a challenge, but some of it is beauty as well. Deborah McNamara, who is the author of Rest, Play, Grow, and she's also written a book more recently on around food. I can't remember the title now for a second, but she has tons and tons of editorials on the beauty behind hypersensitivity, and she's the one who created this infographic just to kind of give us the common 10 traits to sensitivity. And so I'll invite you to go and take a look at that slide. In terms of sensory processing differences, we know now that they are several, more than just the 5, because we used to talk about 5 senses. Now we're talking about 8 different senses, including proprioception, which is the awareness of your body in space, interoception, which is the awareness of the internal portion of your body, and vestibular, which has to do with your spatial orientation of your body in space. These are 3 that have been added to the other 5. And so there are differences between neurotypical and neurodiverse individuals. Many neurodivergent individuals, experience differences in how they perceive and process sensory information. A person may have preferences also in each of these 8 domains. And so a person may also have sensory dislikes or aversion in any of these 8 senses. And so it is common for a neurodiverse person to have differences in eye contact, for example. We know some autistic kids have a hard time with eye contact, and they may look away or use peripheral vision because they have a hard time processing information when they are made to continue the eye contact because it's too much stimulation to listen and to look. And so this is just one example. The other thing that I should mention is not only are there differences in the way that the information is processed, but there's also a continuum in terms of hyposensitive to hypersensitive. And so a hyposensitive individual needs more input in order to feel. I don't know if you've ever noticed that some students tend to bump a lot other students when they're in line, or they're very tactile and they're in people's bubbles and so forth. And so these are individuals sometimes that require additional stimuli because they are hyposensitive. And so at the other extreme of that, when you are hypersensitive, you're extremely sensitive to sensory input. And so those are the kids that have a hard time, for example, with tags in their shirts, or in the way that the socks will be with the lining and the socks will be disturbing to them or distracting, or will be even hurtful, excuse me. We know for a fact now that hypersensitive children actually feel pain much more intensely than the neurotypical person. And so there really is a continuum there from hypo to hyper. So I invite you to go and take a look at all of the examples that I'm putting in this slide. The other thing that we need to know is that there are differences in terms of sensory and learning for our neurodiverse population. Students who are at an optimal energy level are ready to learn. But if they are not in that optimal place, whether they are under or over that optimal place, then they get dysregulated and cannot manage in order to put focus on learning. And so some students may have an energy baseline that is higher or lower than what is optimal for learning. And so we can use sensory tools, for example, and strategies to help them to get to that optimal zone of learning. And so we know, for example, that fidgets or a flexible seat or having the weighted animal, that these are things that can help our neurodiverse population concentrate better. And I would invite you, if you are in a school where there is the presence of an occupational therapist, if you've got concerns in terms of the sensory and the learning, to be able to have that conversation with your colleagues and with the OT to be able to make sense of what that particular student needs. Now, I mentioned earlier about stimming. And so here's the definition and some examples of stimming. And so stimming is a term of self-stimulatory behavior. It is a repetitive action or movement of the body, including making noises. It is a common adaptive behavior amongst our neurodivergent individuals, and it serves an important purpose. The purposes are around self-regulation, and I've got another slide right after this giving all of the different purposes, but in terms of self-regulation, in terms of expression, and even for enjoyment. And so here are some concrete examples of stimming. It could be twirling the hair, it could be biting the nails, it could be rocking back and forth, it could be flapping of the hands, the flicking of the fingers, or the repetitive movement of the finger. It could be the arching of the body. We see that sometimes where they're arching backwards. Visual stimming is also something where the child might be hyper-focused on something that is rhythmical. It could be chewing or mouthing an item, spinning or twirling, a repeating of a behavior like opening and closing a container, for example. And by the way, I don't know if you've noticed, but even the neurotypical individuals, and I know for myself, when I'm under stress, sometimes I will do something to help regulate myself, but it's not as apparent or as obvious. Like, for example, if I've got a ring on my finger, I might play with my ring as I'm talking, and I might even do it underneath the desk. And so nobody sees, but what I am doing is actually a form of stimming. And so we all do it to some extent. It's just that for the neurodivergent person, sometimes the stimming, it can be quite distracting to the group. And so I'm not saying that we should let them stim all the time at any place at any time, but can we give it parameters and outlets to be able to channel that need for stimming? And so I mentioned in terms of having a purpose. And so here are the three categories: self-regulation in terms of expression and in terms of enjoyment. And so stimming can help distract from a dampened sensory input from outside source. It can help enhance or provide additional sensory input. It can help manage to manage our emotions or sensations. It can bring to a state of calm or as we are doing it, and to help handle stress or overwhelming situations. In terms of expression, stimming can be a form of expression to release a strong feeling or reaction. It could communicate frustration, it could communicate fear, overwhelm, etc. It could also communicate joy, excitement, happiness. And so it's not all negative. It could also be when the child's in a good headspace and really happy about a situation, and that can lead to stimming. And stimming can also be done just purely for enjoyment, and that's okay. And so stimming should be honored and left to be completed because it has a purpose, unless the stimming that the student is doing is harming themselves or others. And so to be able to find time and space where we can build in the capacity for them to stim, excuse me. And so another piece that is different between neurotypical and neurodivergent population is when we're talking about empathy. And so it is a myth, by the way, that neurotypical and autistic individuals don't feel empathy for others. The truth is that many of our neurodiverse people process and regulate emotions differently. So they actually are quite empathetic and feel everything that the other person is feeling. But where the differences are is that they have a hard time putting words to what it is that they are experiencing. And so they can't speak to it, but their body very much will react and will take in whatever it is that the other person is going through. And so many neurodivergent individuals experience what we call alexithymia. It is an emotional processing difference where there are challenges in identifying and describing your own emotions. So it's not that they don't have emotions, it's just that they have a hard time either identifying them or to be able to describe them to the other person. And so there are different types of empathy. Emotional empathy can be described as a feeling, experiencing another person's emotion. Cognitive empathy can be described as identifying and understanding how another person is thinking in relation to that feeling. And so a neurodiverse person will have emotional empathy, but has a more difficult time with cognitive empathy. And so studies have even shown that the neurodiverse individual may even have a surplus in terms of emotional empathy. And so they are hyper aroused by the stimuli coming from the emotional empathy vis-a-vis the other person. So they feel what another person is feeling, possibly even quite strongly, overwhelmingly so. And what they may have is less of a cognitive empathy or being able to identify or understand what the emotion is about and why it's occurring. And so I put down here the link to the study that spoke to this. And so if you want to know more, you can go and click on this link. In terms of communication, there are also big differences in communication in terms of neurotypical versus neurodivergent. And even within the neurodivergent population, there are differences. And so there could be differences from a person who is non-speaking to a person who may need a speech augmentative device, whether it is a voice amplifier, or they may need a speech alternative device, which is a speech generating device, sorry, we're Friday afternoon, in order to communicate. They may have a multimodal way of communicating. So they may combine a combination of words, gestures, icons, and so forth. And that's the way that they're able to do it successfully. And also another phenomenon that fits underneath the neurodiverse communication is what we call echolalia. And so echolalia is when we are repeating the language or the word that we have heard previously and that we can repeat the same word over and over again. And so we see oftentimes autistic children and adolescents using or people that use echolalia. But for them, it is a way of communicating. It's not happening randomly. So neurodiverse people may have language processing differences, including the way that they will interpret language, and they may sometimes interpret it very literally. But this is where we need to become allies as educators and school staff members to finding ways to supporting the neurodivergent communication. And so it could be as simple as having multimodal communication options in the classroom, having different devices that are available, recognizing and modeling the different types of communication and honoring the fact that they're all important, accepting whichever way the student will choose to communicate with you, providing access to icons, to symbols, to different devices, as I mentioned up here. The Center of Excellence for Autism, by the way, created a communication board, which is really amazing what they've done. I know that also the Center of Excellence for Speech and Language have also put together a communication board. And so if you haven't seen it before, I invite you to go and take a look on their website. And I think that you can download it. In order to responding to all communication attempts, including echolalia, understanding that the ability to communicate may not be fluid for a neurodiverse individual, and then it may not be as effective or always available, but that's the way that they're able to do it. and helping with the literal interpretation of language, being careful that when we're communicating with them, that we are using something that is very concrete and explicit, using visuals to be able to help and so forth, being careful about things like figurative language, being careful with sarcasm, and also being attuned to our body language. Because many times neurodiverse populations will pick up on our language, body language, excuse me, much more than our verbal communication. And so there's a need there for openness and accommodations around communication. By the way, in the second handout that I sent to you with the presentation slides, you will see a list of different accommodations that you could be applying in the classroom to help support the student be more successful. And these are meant to be tier 1 and 2 accommodations. These are things that all students can benefit from. In terms of motor differences, so we know that in our neurodivergent population, there are not only differences in terms of sensory and in terms of communication and empathy and the way that they empathize and so forth, but there are also differences in terms of motor. And so many neurodivergent individuals experience differences in how they move their bodies or their level of control on their bodies. And so there could be gross motor differences, fine motor differences, and what we call apraxia. And so just to name a few examples in the gross motor, it could be that they need a supportive equipment to move, that their gating to walk is different, their muscle tone is different, so their balance is not the same, their coordination is not the same. And so all that can play in terms of gross motor. In terms of fine motor, it might be difficult for them to manipulate certain objects, to be able to pinch or to grasp, to use scissors, to be able to button, thinking about how they're getting dressed to go outside, and when they're coming back from outside, the zippers, using utensils to eat and so forth. And so these could be all different types of differences and challenges for our neurodiverse population. Apraxia is when students have neurological differences in the sense that they are not able to control certain movements of their bodies. So their body will move without them wanting it to move. And this also includes sound. And so thinking about sometimes there are students that are blurting out certain sounds. Think about Tourette Syndrome, for example. Tourette Syndrome is a perfect example of apraxia and how this fits into the neurodiverse differences. And so again, there are a number of adapted tools and strategies, whether we're using pencil grips or we're using an adapted keyboard or an adapted scissor, that can help provide accommodation to help the student with motor differences. It may be beneficial, again, to communicate with your school occupational therapist and to see what they have to suggest that could be specific to that individual's needs and challenges. In terms of play, and so play as well, there are differences between neurotypical and neurodivergent individuals. Play is often talked about as if it is where a relief from a serious learning, but for some children, play is the learning. This is from Fred Rogers. I just wanted to reiterate that, of course, we're in an academic setting, and yes, academics take a huge space, but it doesn't mean that we're not learning through play. Play can be a medium in which we build our skills and capacity and so forth. And so in terms of our neurodivergent population, there are a lot of misconceptions in the way that they play, and that sometimes people have the reflex or the belief that the neurodiverse person isn't playing properly. And so how can we force if we force, our ideas of play onto that student, then they are not even really playing anymore, because all they're doing is masking and trying to find ways to please us. And so when it is playtime, consider if the activity is actually play or work. Is there an outcome? Is there an expectation? Is there pleasure? Or is the child doing it for the simple enjoyment? And so is the student enjoying the play? Are they free to play as they see fit? Let students choose what they play with. It might be the fringe of the rug, or it might be the lid of a container, but that's okay, and that's play to them. Allow for play also to be repetitive. We sometimes have the urge to push children to play at different games or to finish their play quickly because it feels like as if it is repetitive. Remember that true play needs to be engaging, needs to be free and needs to be expressive. And so it's not about pleasing the adults or trying to fit in. It is about whatever it is for the student that allows for that enjoyment and that expression. In terms of executive functioning, we know that there are differences between our neurotypical and our neurodivergent. I should also mention that even within our neurodivergent population, we know that a child who is very immature, or even a teen that is stuck developmentally and very, very impulsive, that this will cause impacts on executive functioning, because executive functioning requires prefrontal cortex activity. And so, by the way, just to define for those who may not know, executive functioning is basically the set of cognitive processes that allow for us to plan, to prepare, to problem solve, to judge time, to focus on, to be able to focus and pay attention, to self-regulate, and to remember steps to a plan. And so these are all the different elements that are at play in terms of executive functioning. So we can imagine for our neurodiverse population that they may have a harder time with regulating their emotions, not just because of the sensory gating system and the overload, but also because of the executive functioning not working fully or properly. That they may have a hard time with focusing, that they may have a hard time with organization and so forth. And so they may have challenges with everyday tasks that are easy to take for granted, such as keeping your desk organized, or for turning finished work in, or not shouting out an answer in class. And so these challenges are not present. These challenges are not present because the student is just not trying hard enough, or that they're being lazy, or that they're doing it on purpose. It's because of the lack of integrative functioning. And so can we provide support for them, whether it is visual cues or visual organizers or timers or note-taking supports and et cetera? I mean, there's so many different examples of measures that we can put in place to help them with their executive functioning. So I mentioned before that executive functioning requires prefrontal cortex development. So even when we're talking about a young person, thinking about our 4 or 5-year-olds and those that are working in preschool, neurotypical or neurodiverse, because they are still so young in age, executive functioning really isn't working properly just yet at that age. So it is to be expected that they will not have that full capacity. And so we need to be careful about some of the approaches that we have, expecting that the neurodivergent student will be able, for example, to give you eye contact at all times when eye contact is actually quite triggering to them, or that we expect that they're able to function well in an environment that is meant for a neurotypical person where there hasn't been any neurodiverse accommodations, or that they're able to follow a daily routine without too much struggle, or that they're able to stay seated at their desk on a regular chair without doing any types of micro movement, and that they're supposed to be functional and successful in those circumstances, and that they're able to remain focused at all times on that task that is given, that they are able to tune into the adult verbal instruction, without needing too many visual cues, and that they will be able to manage in transitions easily, whether in the hallway, in the schoolyard, or in the cafeteria, and that the sensory isn't an element to take into consideration. And so all of these expectations are not adapted to our neurodiverse population. The other thing too that we need to be mindful about is the level of verbal communication that we're doing with this clientele. Because oftentimes when we're talking too much, talking too fast, giving way too much information at one time, we're actually keeping them aroused in their limbic system, and it could keep them in flight, fight, freeze response. And so rather than having them stay in that survival mode where they are hyper focused on our body language, trying to slow down, limiting the verbal communication, giving visual cues, only giving short and explicit explanations one at a time. And especially when the student is upset emotionally, we know now with research that that auditory processing doesn't work very well when the student is upset. And so when we're talking to them and using verbal cues instead of nonverbal, they're having an even harder time to follow us when they are emotionally upset. The other thing too is that given attachment, I mean, all children intend to do well. All children want to please. And so sometimes when we're giving off in our nonverbals the message that we are frustrated with them, or that we feel like we can't handle them, there's this fear in the student, in the child, that we will say, I've had it with you. I don't want, like, I can't handle this anymore. Like leave the class, or take a break for a second, or take a timeout, or whatever that is. And the fear of losing that attachment. And so if we're in a place where we are overwhelmed as the adult accompanying the child, and that the timing is just off, and that we're just ourselves dysregulated, this is where work as a team, get a colleague to be able to help out. Maybe the student needs to go for a walk. Maybe the student needs to go spend time in the nurturing support center if you have one, and so forth, and to be with another adult rather than saying to the student, I've had it with you. And so the other thing that doesn't work very well with this population are more of the conventional approaches to discipline, because when we're trying to control the behavior through consequences, and I'm not saying there shouldn't be natural consequences in life, and I'm not saying that sometimes a suspension is not necessary for safety issues, but what I am saying is that if we're trying to utilize these conventional discipline approaches to control the behavior of the child, and that we think that they're going to self-regulate better because of these types of approaches, we are mistaken. Because not only is this going to frustrate the student further, this will then dysregulate them, and then there will be more behavior. And so it's about trying to find ways to put in place accommodations to help minimize the stress in the body. The other thing to keep in mind as well that might have an impact is the way that we see and think things in terms of our relationship with the student. And so we may believe that given our role, because I'm a teacher, because I'm a support staff, because I'm a principal, by default, given my role, the student should listen to me because I am the adult in charge. Now, understand that children and adults don't see eye to eye on this, because for a child, it's not who you are and what you know that matters. It is about the relationship. And so I remember, when I was a professional and I used to work in schools, sometimes, and I rarely was in one place long enough that I could build relationship with students. And so I would often get the request from school staff asking me to step into a crisis situation, and hoping that because I'm the expert, that I would be able, with my know-how, to calm the student down. And what I would say to the adults that were there is that if I'm a nobody to that student, I could have a PhD in self-regulation and it doesn't matter. It's not about what I know, it is who I am to that child. And so am I important to them? Do they feel safe with me? Do they know that I'm there for the right reasons? And so once you've got the relationship, it is through the relationship that we are able to better accompany them and help them to be more successful. And so sometimes when the adults are tired or overwhelmed or frustrated or discouraged, we have the reflex at times to focus on trying to gain more knowledge, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not necessarily about what we know. It's more about the dynamic with the student. And so sometimes, unfortunately, we may ourselves shut down a little bit our sense of empathy towards that child, and our nurturing responsibility may lessen, where we are trying to seek leverage or forcefulness in order to get the student to do what we want them to do. And the danger with that is that it becomes a vicious circle. It becomes a vicious circle that because the given the hypersensitivity and the defendedness and the high intense emotions and the immaturity, that this makes way from time to time for behavior that may be alienating to us, that if we become personally upset by that we get frustrated, and that we act out a harsh discipline, or that we're being reactive rather than being reflective, that this will just become a more of a vicious circle, because we're creating more defendedness in the child, which will create more behavior and so forth. And so really being careful about not just what we're saying, but what our body is conveying. For those who have taken CPI training or BMS training, this is what they're talking about when we're talking about de-escalation. And so trying to be mindful of your body language, taking a step back and trying to find a way to diffuse the situation. The other thing to keep in mind is compliance-based strategies. Like, for example, ABA. Oh, I forgot to take this out. I didn't have a chance to put in a video. Sorry, guys, but I'm sure there are videos out there, many videos out there on adults who, autistic adults who have shared publicly the harmfulness of a compliance-based strategy such as ABA, and that has caused not only distress and anxiety for them, but that they've had long-term problems due to these compliance-based strategies. Now, part of what's dangerous with these types of strategies when we're addressing a vulnerable population is that we're giving the underlying message that the child should do our bidding regardless of how they feel about it. So if they don't feel comfortable, or that they feel overwhelmed, or that they feel stressed, we're putting them at risk in the future, potentially for an abusive situation. And this is one example of, but think about it, if we force a child beyond their willingness to do something because we think it's for their good, and that they're not able to take it, to understand the differentiation, and that they're taking it literally, then what we're doing is that we are prepping them to being compliant at all cost. And so we need to be careful about the long-term impacts of some of these approaches. The other issue in terms of a compliance-based strategy is that we are forcing, maybe not consciously, but we are forcing the student to mask and to adhere to a neurotypical norm. And this can be detrimental to the child's mental health and physical health as well. Compliance-based strategies do not validate the internal feeling or need of the neurodiverse individual. It also overlooks the critical development areas such as self-awareness and self-advocacy. We want to be able with the student to try different things and let them explore and discover what works for them and what doesn't, rather than us imposing what we think they should be doing and what we think they need. We need to be doing this together, side by side, because not only does this help them discover what it is that works and doesn't work for them, but they also become their best self-advocate. And again, being able to self-advocate is what will protect them from potential abusive situations in the future. And so really being careful. I mean, I wouldn't recommend this for any child, but even less so with a neurodiverse child. And so the other piece that doesn't work as well with this population is to use their interests or an item that they enjoy as a reward. And I'll explain why. In the educational setting, it is common to see a student's favorite item or favorite activity kept away from them in order to use it as a reinforcer for them to work. So first work, and then you'll get your favorite toy. And so while this has been done with the best intention to motivate the student to complete the task, the reality is that these joys and interests and comforts were withheld from the student. And so this has an effect on motivation. It has an effect on this feeling of safety and comfort, and it teaches neurodivergent children to show compliance for the sake of compliance. And so in other words, you tell me what to do, and I'll have to do it, or else I won't get the thing that I love or that I want or that I need. And so you could see how, for a neurotypical person who's able to understand the intricacies of things, it impacts very differently than a child who takes things very literally. And so studies have shown that using rewards to motivate students, such as prizes and tokens, actually decreases the response rate by weakening the intrinsic motivation. So rather than them being motivated by their own desires, they are doing it for the pure, simple reason of pleasing the adults. And so this means that the rewards aren't successful on the long term. They only work for so long. And the same studies have also found that genuine encouragement in the context of a strong and supportive relationship, not just the praise for the sake of praise, but doing it in a very genuine way, that this will improve response rates, increase intrinsic motivation, and will help the child to make a connection to what is more tangible in terms of motivation. And so there's a link here to those studies for those who want to read more about that, and so forth. So I mentioned many times masking and how masking can have an impact in terms of wellness and mental health. And so what masking is when a neurodivergent person works to compensate, suppress, or hide their natural quality or difference. And so this can occur in a variety of different settings for different reasons, and it can be conscious or unconscious. And so here are examples of masking: trying to fit in or trying to uphold social norms in order to feel a sense of belonging, keeping oneself safe from bullying, judgment, or stigma, performing at school. Sorry, I'm mixing up things. I'm going to get to the what. It's the reasons why a person would mask. And so we're masking to be able to fit in. We're masking to be able to keep ourselves safe from wounding from others, to be able to be more performant at school, to try to make friends and fit in. And oftentimes some kids are not meaning to mask, but it has become such a habit for them because they've known this forever that it's become a default. And so some examples of masking could be the trying to withstand a sensory discomfort. So for example, auditory discomfort or visual discomfort, that the child or the teen won't disclose the discomfort in front of others to not feel like they're different, or they will minimize or hide their stimming in front of others, or they will mirror or mimic the facial expressions or gestures of others because they think that that's what's expected, or that they will force themselves to give eye contact because that's what they think that they should be doing, or that they will downplay or avoid their personal interests because they've felt or understood that other people are fed up of their repeated interests and so forth. And these are just some examples, but this is what we call masking. And so the dangers of masking, like I was mentioning, is the impact on mental health. And so the neurodivergent population reports that masking can be extremely stressful, exhausting, and can create dysregulation even further in the system because we're not letting it out, and eventually can lead to burnout. Studies have shown, and you've got two links here to if you want to go and take a look, that masking can lead to some extremely negative outcomes, including higher rates of depression and suicidal ideation. As educators and allies, it is our job to come alongside that and to be able to teach social skills that social skills that promote masking, not trying to enforce eye contact, for example, embracing and supporting individual student interests, openly talking to students about neurodiversity and promoting an environment of acceptance, encouraging self-advocacy by helping students recognize their individual differences and to be able to not just be self-aware, but to advocate for what they need. And this is so important. And so there are so many benefits of neurodiverse affirming education. There are benefits to the student, there are benefits for their families, for teachers and staff, and for peers. And so what I mean by neurodiverse affirming education, part of that are the accommodations that you have in that handout that I sent to you. And so I invite you to go and take a look at all of these different sections that are there, and so forth in terms of accommodations. How are we on time? Okay, we're pretty good. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is, so what does this look like having a neurodiverse affirming practice, what does that look like in our day-to-day and built in through the pyramid of intervention? For those who haven't heard me speak before on the pyramid of intervention, the measures are split up into 3 sections. So you've got universal best practices for all. And so this is done in the classroom, this is done in the hallway, this is done in the schoolyard and so forth. And these are meant to be beneficial to all. Then on top of universal best practices, for some students that need more, so thinking about level 1, level 2, level 3 level of support, for some students, they need tier 2 level of support, and it is not meant to be for all, it is meant to be for some. And we are, for some of those students, we're not doing one or the other, we're doing the two. So we're continuing to do the universal best practices, and we're adding to that the targeted practices. And for few students, we are using not just the universal, not just the targeted, but we're adding on the third level of the pyramid, the individualized, more intensified measures for them to be successful. So at a tier 1 level, we are talking here about prevention. We are talking about supports from the teacher, from the homeroom teacher, and from the specialists, support staff if they're in the classroom and so forth. And so whomever, and if it's in the schoolyard, it would be whomever is there on supervision. And so if we're talking about in the classroom, examples of preventative universal practices could be, for example, setting up the physical environment, physical and social environment of the classroom, where we are being inclusive and honoring the differences between neurotypical and neurodiverse. We may be using inclusive practices that move away from the neurotypical norms that will push the student to mask. We may be offering an array of tools and resources to answer to the range of needs, differences, and interests. And an example of that could be flexible seating. So when we're talking about inclusive practices, we're talking about the middle here, where we're bringing together our neurotypical clientele and our neurodiverse clientele, and we are catering to both. You don't need to do measures just for our neurodivergent population and that you have to duplicate everything. Anything that goes for a neurodivergent person can be just as beneficial to a neurotypical person. And so it is okay to offer measures, support measures for the whole class, neurotypical or not, neurodivergent or not, I mean. And so some examples in terms of universal best practices honoring neurodiversity could be, for example, expectations around lineup. Not all students can handle being in a row just so, because sometimes physical proximity, they're too close to the other person and it's too much for them to handle, that they need to have more bubble space, or that they need to be at the front of the line or at the back of the line, that sometimes for them being quiet the whole time is really difficult, given the fact that they're in transition and that's quite triggering in terms of the sensory. And so just being sensitive to things like lining up for our neurodiverse population. The same thing goes for phys ed. You know, and I don't know if you've noticed, but the gyms in our schools are very echoey. And so it's actually quite disturbing and triggering for some of our students. And so sometimes we have certain rules and regulations when it comes to phys ed, but our neurodiverse population need additional support measures in order to be successful in things like gym. And so keeping that in mind. In terms of the setup of your classroom, and so here is a picture of a class that has not kept in mind neurodiversity. It is focused on neurotypical approach, where things are very cluttered, things are very bright, where there's way too much going on, and how this can be completely destabilizing to a neurodiverse person. And so be aware that your classroom decor can be overstimulating to a neurodivergent student. While the decor may appear fun or appealing, where there's lots of bright colors with no place for the eyes to rest, this could be very hard on the sensory system of a neurodiverse student. And so consider toning down the decor in your class. Consider having fewer decorations, having less intense colors, having a place perhaps for the student where it could be that they're in the front of the class to help limit some of the distraction of the movement of the other students. Maybe thinking about, for those that have a lot of materials, putting away the materials in solid bins. So there isn't too much distraction about all of the items that are out, or that if you have shelving, maybe having a curtain in front of the shelving to be able to hide the stimuli of all of the stuff that's out. And so you'll likely find a less stimulating classroom to be beneficial for our neurotypical children as well, not just for the neurodiverse children. I invite you to go and take a look at the CBM website, where Martine Demers, who is one of my colleagues who retired now, who's been part of the Center of Excellence for Behavior Management. She has created these 2 documents on just kind of thinking about the setup of your classroom and the way that you have laid out the desks of the students to be able to prime attention. So you've got the link here to be able to go and take a look at the documents. Again, in terms of sensory input, maybe putting, in terms of the neon lights, removing some of the neons, or maybe having a cover to be able to dim a little bit some of the neon brightness of the lights. Maybe having privacy folders to be able to help, especially if they're doing individual work, to having the noise canceling headsets, and so forth. And so there's so many items now that exist that all students can benefit from, not just a neurodivergent population. In terms of flexibility in the classroom, maybe having a range of level of desks, having standing desks, or maybe having cushions where they get to sit on the floor, and trying out different types of seats. Now, keep in mind that not all tools work for everybody. We need to try them out. We need to see what works and what is adapted and what fits for that child. If the tool becomes a distraction, then it is not a good fit. And it's not about trying only one and then saying that none of them work because we only tried one and it didn't work. It's about trying out different ones and discovering and seeing, is this one more beneficial? Maybe that one's more beneficial. And so for those who have nurturing support centers in their room, I invite you to have a variety of these different things so students can try them out in your space before they bring them to the classroom. In terms of tools, trying to figure out, are there certain sensory tools that can help with stimming and with sensory management? And again, picking the right tool for the tool to not be a distraction. And there's a difference, by the way, between a tool and a toy. I'm presenting next week on tools versus toys. And so I invite you to register and to go and take a look at that presentation. And if you cannot register to be there live, you will have access to the recording. In terms of creating a sensory retreat for that student, having a quiet corner in the classroom, or having maybe something in the hallway, or that there's another space in the building where the student can go in terms of retreat, including sensory breaks in the day. And so brain breaks can be part of it, but some students don't do well with high level activities. It actually dysregulates them further. And so maybe doing a very quiet, fine motor activity could be something that is helpful for that student. Again, providing a choice for them to be able to discover what works and what doesn't. Making a sensory activity fun and engaging for them, helping the student recognize their internal cues as they're trying different things and seeing what works and what doesn't, and to help them discover to their best of their abilities if they need the break or not. Please keep in mind that some students, no matter how much you've tried, given their immaturity or their impulsivity, they have a really hard time recognizing they need a break. And so can we be that inner compass for them to tell them when they need that break? Now, in terms of tools, it's not just about providing the tools. These tools need to be introduced. They need to be explained. They need to be modeled. The student needs to explore a variety of different things. There needs to be structure around the use of these tools, explaining that they are tools, not toys, and what are the what, the when, the how, for how long, and so forth. And so having all of the parameters around the structure around the use of these tools, in terms of how they're set up, in terms of the safety piece of it. I'll never forget, I saw a student one time on a wobble stool who was kneeling on it and was trying to stand onto the stool. And so that's dangerous. And not letting students do anything and everything with those tools, and being able to introduce, to model, and to put those parameters. In terms of executive functioning, what can we do to help our students be more successful in supporting them with the executive functioning? And so adapting the environment accordingly, modifying the classroom where we're adding some physical barriers to put separations in the group or in the class, reducing the distractions, maybe having homework bins, maybe having seats, flexible seating that can help promote attention. In terms of routines and scheduling, providing that structure and predictability, having the visuals, visual charts, visual calendars, maybe the student themselves need to have a visual, maybe for their tools or something like that. In terms of organization and time management, helping to organize them with bins and with labels and with reminders and checklists and time timers or wonder clocks. There's so many different ways that we can help them to be more successful with their organization and their time management. In terms of helping them outline their steps, there is a material out there called Get Ready, Do Done. I don't know if some of you have seen this before, the Get Ready, Do Done. And so I invite you to go and take a look on the CBM website. We've got a section dedicated to executive functioning underneath academic tools. And so the purpose of this tool is that when a child has a hard time seeing the end product of what it is that we're expecting for them, that we help them break down the steps. So I'll just give you an example at the kindergarten level. And so at the kindergarten level, we would show in the done what is the final product, what it's going to look like. And then in the do, we show them what are the steps, that they need to do to be able to complete the steps to have the finished product. And then we backtrack one step even further, where what do they need to get ready in order to do the task and have the final project? So what materials do they need, and so forth. And so this is an example at the kindergarten level. At the elementary level, it could be, for example, if you're doing a task to create a little car, if we write down the steps of what they need to do to be able to make the car, and what are the materials that they need to get ready to do and have the product done. And so we're going at it backwards. For high school, it could be that they need to work on a presentation to have a visual for their presentation. And so what do they need in terms of steps to be able to complete this task? And what do they need in order to get ready to even do the steps? And so Get Ready, Do Done is a way to help them with their issues with executive functioning, to breaking down the task, especially when we've got a task that has many, many steps to it. It really helps to make it more concrete and more visual and more explicit. And so I invite you to go and take a look at the documentation on Get Ready, Do Done. In terms of their interests, when they have these very intense, minimal interest into minimal things, how can we help share the enjoyment of those interests, join in with the item or the activity that the student really truly enjoys? Being able to talk about it. So let your student talk about this or share their interest regularly, even if you've heard it a million times. For you, it might be annoying, but for them, they love it so much that every time they do it, they love it just as much. Being able, for example, to incorporate their interest into academics. And so that could help with motivation and getting them to stay engaged and receptive into the activity. So offering a themed activity where the theme is a theme of their interest. Picking a book where it's their favorite character or their favorite topic. Providing manipulatives or sensory tools that actually are of their favorite character or their favorite theme. Having the student write about, if they have a writing activity they need to do, maybe use their interest into the writing activity. Using clips and songs, for example, of their interest in their learning. So there's so many ways that we can use that to the benefit. Honoring the value, recognizing that the interest may be deeply comforting and meaningful to that student, even though for us it is repetitive, for them it is not, and it is very comforting and meaningful. Educating peers about that, talking to students about neurodiversity and special interests, like the fact that some students can love their interests so much that they can't learn that they could learn basically everything there is to know about it. And so to be able to normalize that and to validate it for them. In terms of movement, in terms of movement, having brain breaks can be a way to help reduce the stress in the body. It helps with stimming and so forth. And again, being mindful about high-level activities where it could dysregulate them further, and to really have a range of different types of activities. Now, brain breaks are not just for elementary. Brain breaks can be just as valid in high school. Editopia wrote an article at the beginning of the school year on 17 different examples of brain breaks at the high school. So for those that are here today that work at the high school, I invite you to go and take a look at that article. It might be, like I said, not a high level activity, but a more quiet time activity, whether we're doing origami or we're doing knitting or we're doing doodling and coloring or mandalas or search and finds and mazes and so forth. There are so many different activities that the student could be doing that can help in terms of stimulation, overstimulation, and so forth. One thing that is so vital for a neurodiverse student is to have a place where they can reset and that they're able to just ground themselves and to move away from overstimulation. Could we have a section in the classroom or in the hallway, and you don't have to buy a tent or something super expensive. You can make it out of a cardboard box. You can use a desk and the student can go and hide underneath. There's a piece of fabric that was Velcroed on around it. This is an example at the high school. So can we have that as well in our high school classrooms where students can have respite from the group? And at the same time, because they're still in the classroom, there isn't as much transition that is there to be able to distract them. In terms of tier 2, now we're looking at some of the same tier 1 strategies, but we want to make them more systematic, more intentional. And so maybe the student needs to be assigned a specific flexible seat, or they need to have the quiet corner be scheduled preventatively in their daily calendar. So we're not waiting for them to be disorganized for them to go there, but that we actually do this preventatively, because if they only go there when they're upset, then they're never in a good place where they're able to try out different tools and see what works and what doesn't for them. And so you want them to have been introduced to the space, that they've explored different tools that are there, that they've tried it many times. And when this becomes second nature and that they feel comfortable in this space, then they will automatically, naturally gravitate towards that space when they need it. It could be that you put together a bin for the student with different fidgets or different activities or books or things like that the student could be using at their desk. So if they don't need to go to the quiet corner, or if you already have a student that's there and occupying the space and that 2 students need the space, then the other student could be using their bin at their desk in order to recenter themselves. It could be a fine motor activity in there or something like that. It could be that we have a movement station in a corner of the classroom and it's well hidden from the group so it doesn't distract, or that we do it in the hallway. And so for tier 2, we would be scheduling this for the student. We could even have a mobile quiet corner. I know my colleague Zarina, who's working at the center with me, especially during COVID, when it was an issue with the bubbles, she had created this mobile sensory corner where this was available for students anywhere and everywhere. And that was really helpful. Having movement stations, by the way, doesn't need to be that you purchase these very expensive decals on the floor. As you can see here, this is just a laminated poster that is stuck onto the wall. It could be as simple as that. It doesn't have to be that we purchase all of these different decals. If the student needs time away from the class because it is too hard for them to manage, how about sending them to an adult with an envelope? And in that envelope, there is an activity, whether fine motor or physical activity, where they're going to go to take respite from the group and from the class and so forth, and to be able to find a way to recenter themselves. And to do it this way really kind of honors the dignity of the child. Rather than saying, get out of my classroom, to be able to send them with an envelope changes the whole dynamic. In terms of tier 3, now we're talking about support staff being much more involved with our tier 3 students that need that extra supervision. And so what they may benefit from is a daily check-in where the adult is taking the time, and we've assigned an adult to the student, and we've scheduled their check-ins. And so the student knows, so it's predictable. They know when they're going to see that adult. And part of the check-in is for them to see if they have their material, if they are regulated, if things are going okay. But it's also a very nice, genuine time of connection for the student to build a rapport with the adult. And we want this to take place because if the child is dysregulated and the adult is trying to intervene, there's a better chance that the adult will have more influence if they have a good relationship. And so this is basically, I already mentioned this in terms of using time away instead of time out. And so using the quiet corner, using the You've Got Mail, using the nurturing support center. There's many ways where students can go in other spaces in the building and still feel like they are successful and they're not sent home. They are not, in their reflection room or something like that. And it's a whole way of going about it that is much more positive and constructive. In terms of the nurturing support center, we have some students that are frequent flyers that will spend a lot of time in the nurturing support center. There are sometimes students that have a reverse schedule where the hub is a nurturing support center and they will spend pockets of time in the classroom. And so this is why it's so important to have an academic component built into the nurturing support center. And this can help during class time, but also during transitions. In terms of emotion support, the nurturing support center could have a section dedicated to emotions, but this also can take place in the classroom where we're reading books on emotions, where we're using different cards on emotions, talking about emotions. And so it's so important, especially with our neurodiverse population, to support them with their feelings and emotions. They need us to co-regulate. Because given everything that I've said up to now, we know that they have a hard time with self-regulation. They need to have us accompany them to co-regulate in order to validate those emotions, in order to provide those supports, and just having it part of their everyday life to help them build the capacity to manage those emotions to the best of their ability and to be able to express them. The emotions room, if you've got one in your school, can be another outlet where students can go to let out that very intense emotions. And I would suggest that this room is not only used in crisis intervention because students will not feel comfortable to go there only when they're upset. They need to go there preventatively as well to be able to discover what works and what doesn't for them, and for them to build that comfort within that space. And so when we are being triggered as adults, it is about trying to detach ourselves to the best of our capacity. I forgot to click on this image, using the lens to understand the student, but using the mirror to be able to keep ourselves in check. And so we're constantly trying to keep in check who's the student we're dealing with, what's the context in which we're in, and where am I at in my emotional state? Am I being triggered? Do I need to have a colleague step in to be able to help? And so these are things, especially with tier 3 students, these are things that need to be kept in mind. And so when we're trying to put together an action plan, and this oftentimes is needed and necessary for a tier 3 student, we are keeping in mind these three elements into building the plan for the student. For those who are curious about seeing an example of an action plan, you've got a link on the website to go and see. I've got 2 different examples there. In terms of recess and lunch, we know for those students who are being easily overwhelmed that recess and lunch is very difficult. And so can we build in some pockets of time and space where they can have maybe a smaller group to eat with, or that they do a one-to-one game that is more structured with an adult instead of being outside where it is unstructured and way too chaotic for them. In terms of the IEP, so if we're past the action plan and we want to put together an IEP, the list of accommodations that I sent you with the slides are part of the neurodiversity affirming IEP goals. So I invite you to go and take a look at those. They come together with this slide. And so in order to support and to compensate for the neurodiverse student, it's all about anticipating, not being surprised by some of the reactions that they have, because we understand where they're coming from. Especially the child who's sensitive that will be overwhelmed, because we will react very differently when we are expecting it versus when we're taken by surprise. Thinking about times and places where they need that support and compensation. So I mentioned recess and during lunch, but also in the hallway. also going to the bathroom, also when there's a substitute teacher. Many of neurodiverse students do not do well with substitute teachers. And so how can we help, whether to compensate, whether it is, if we can, to introduce a substitute teacher, or that the student will go to an alternative space and not be with the substitute because they just can't handle it. And so there's such a fine dance between protecting the child from all of this, but at the same time, not overprotecting the child where they're not able to discover their strength in that and to take risks and to try different things. And so that dance, that fine line between these two realities. If things have fallen apart in the situation and the student has overreacted and we have lost our patience with the student, or we've said something that we have regretted, it's never too late to be able to bridge that, to be able to say to the student, it's not what I meant to do. Today was difficult. Tomorrow's another day. I look forward for us to trying this again. And so we make mistakes. We're human. We are all a species of emotion. And so it is to be expected that we too will have good days and bad days like our students. And so to be able to discuss that in a way that even though we had a bad day, that it doesn't change the fact that they're your student and that you still want to work with them, and to be explicit and to say that to the student. In terms of tier 3, how important it is to work as a team, to be able to support the weight of the student, to be able to share the responsibility, because it is too much for one adult to handle all day, every day. And so building in different pockets of time where we can share that weight. In terms of the CBM website, I want to now stop sharing my slides so I can show you different sections on the website that cater to neurodiverse populations. So I will just end my PowerPoint, stop sharing for a second. Okay, I just put this down, open. So for those that are not familiar with the CBM website, I'm going to put into the chat the address. So the address is www.cebm.ca. And so when you go to this website, you will come to the main page. And onto the main page, you will find different events that are available, different articles that are available, and so forth. And so where I want to take you is to the Resource Center. So when you click onto the Resource Center, it will open up a whole second website. And underneath the second website, you will find under Theoretical Framework, a page called The Sensitive Child. And so here I've got different resources that are available and here are the articles from Deborah that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation. So I invite you to go and take a look at this page. I also have a page dedicated to sensory and OT perspective, talking about different sensory systems and in terms of inclusion, in terms of sensory processing and so forth. So I invite you to go and take a look at that. If we go underneath challenges, I invite you to go and take a look. I've got sensory issues and I've got neurodivergence. So under sensory issues, I've got a page dedicated to myths versus realities and different articles available to making a better understanding of some of these sensory challenges. Same thing with neurodivergence. So here I've got a page dedicated to neurodiversity. I have put here the link to the Center of Excellence for Autism, where they define what is ASD. This is the presentation that I did with them last year, so it is available here. I've got certain materials available from Autism Level Up, and then I've got a bunch of different editorials that are available. So I invite you to go and take a look at that. If we go underneath practices, you will find here the tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 practices, plus the during transitions. So here you will find the pyramid of intervention, the recommendations of interventions at tier 1, 2, and 3. And you've got underneath the video capsules and the documents that you can download that are named within the page that are here. So you have tier 1, you have tier 2 that are more targeted. Here's the check-in, talking about the designated area. You've got mail, they're all available here, movement stations. And then in terms of tier 3, you've got, again, different resources that are available, the emotions room and so forth. If you want to download certain materials, you've got all of the materials that are available here, from the quiet corner to flexible classroom, to the personal bin, to the emotion intervention materials, all of that is available on this page. If you want to know more about the Nurturing Support Center or the Emotions Room, if you go underneath Space and we go to Space Walkabout, we will have documentation and a video that talks about the Nurturing Support Center and another one that talks about the Emotions Room. So I invite you to go and take a look at that. So I will stop the recording.